Turning wooden pens and pencils has become an extremely popular and profitable hobby among woodworkers. Many people give them away as gifts while others sell them through craft shows and galleries, but until now pens and other small craft items were turned on a lathe. Beautiful as they are, everyone has made virtually the same style, round. Now, using Phantom's milling systems, you can combine the template follower with spirals and indexing to create totally unique styles that are beautiful and command a higher price and value. Shown here are just a few sample designs that we will demonstrate in this video. Once you've mastered these techniques, use your imagination to design your own styles, but be careful, milling pens can be very addicting. You can make pens out of just about any type of material that you can think of. All types of exotic hardwoods are available at a surprisingly modest cost. Man-made materials such as imitation ivory, horn, and tortoiseshell are also available. Or you can use solid surface materials such as corian. Even antler can be used to make extremely attractive pens and other craft items. You can either purchase the pen blanks or you can cut your own. For the small pens, you'll need blanks approximately 1/2 inch square by 5 inches long. And for the larger style pens, you'll need blanks approximately 3/4 of an inch square by 5 inches long. For the first pen, we used a piece of maple burl. This piece of burl costs $2 and will make anywhere from 6 to 8 pens. Next, we cut the blanks to length. These cuts should be as square as possible. You need to cut the blanks slightly longer than the tubes that come with the pen kit. Then drill the blanks with a bit that is called for with the pen kit. We used a V-block to keep the blank square and straight when drilling. There are several types of glue available for gluing the tube inside the blank. We chose to use hot stuff because it cures almost instantly, and we can continue making the pens without waiting for the glue to dry. Always check that the brass tube slides easily into the blank before applying any glue. If you use the cap from the glue to hold the tube, you won't glue your fingers together. Apply enough glue so that there are no voids, or the blank can come apart when you are milling. Then push the tube into the blank until it is flush with the bottom. When the glue has set, you can use a barrel trimmer to cut the end of the blank flush and square to the end of the tube. Squaring the ends will keep the blanks from bowing when you tighten the nut on the double pen mandrel. It will also give you a nice clean edge when it comes time to assemble the pen. Now the blanks are ready to go onto the machine. For the first pen, we will remove the template base so that you can more easily see just what's going on. You'll need to replace the index drive center with the pen mandrel. Be sure that the number 2 Morris taper shaft is clean before you insert it into the spindle shaft. Lightly tap the end of the mandrel to ensure that the tapered shaft wedges tightly into the spindle shaft, but don't overdo it. Then place 2 of the bushings onto the mandrel. followed by one of the blanks, a third bushing, the second blank, a fourth bushing, and the nut. Next, slide the tailstock up against the end of the mandrel and lock it in place. Don't forget to tighten the nut on the end of the mandrel approximately 1/2 of a turn, or the blank will spin and shatter when you start to mill. To mill a straight round pin, we use a 1.5 inch diameter surface planing bit, just like we do when milling larger diameter stock to a round. On the very first pin, you should start by milling it oversized to check the setup. To set the plunge depth, simply plunge the bit onto the blank. Then set the plunge depth stop on your router. To keep the bit from running into the spindle shaft or the live center, position the router at the end of the blank and set the stops so that the bit cannot cut any further. The center of the bit needs to go just past the end of the blank. The router bit should now be positioned approximately 1/2 of an inch off center. If you have the optional Y-axis drive screw, you can simply set the stops on the screw to hold the router in position. If you have the standard captive nut, you will need to disconnect it so that the router carrier can slide freely. If you have the optional split nut, you can simply open the nut to move the carrier tray. Replace the index gear on the spindle shaft with the handle so that you can freely rotate the blank. Then turn on your router and plunge it down the full depth off to the side of the blank. Then bring the router over to the cutting position and mill the blank round by slowly sliding the router carrier as you rotate the stock by hand. The surface planing bit will give you a smooth surface that is perfectly straight. Again, we milled the first pin blank oversized so that we could check to see that the machine is set level. We then measured both ends. If there is a difference, you should raise or lower the tailstock end and mill the blank again until it is the same size on both ends. The bushing set that comes with the pin mandrel is usually the same size as the finished diameter of the pin. So to set the plunge depth, you simply plunge the router bit down until it just touches the bushings. Then set and lock the plunge depth stop of your router in place. Now mill the blank to the finished size by rotating the blank as you slowly move the router carrier from end to end. Once the machine is set up, you can mill as many pens as you wish directly to the finished round in just one pass. The harder the wood, the smoother the surface will be and the less sanding you will have to do when the pen is finished. With most pens, you can mill both halves at the same time as we have shown here. Some styles, however, you will mill only one half of the pen at a time. The finished part should require very little, if any, finish sanding at this point. We have found it much quicker and easier to do any finish sanding on a bench grinder using flutter sheets. One very quick and easy way to finish the pen is to use French polish. You can simply wipe it on and then buff it out. Each pen kit will come with all of the individual components necessary to assemble the pen. You can either use a bench vise to press the parts together as we have done here, or you can use a hand clamp. This is a very simple style that once you are set up, will only take a couple of minutes to mill, finish, and assemble. Next we'll look at a couple of other styles where we will start using the indexing and spiraling capabilities of the machine. For the next style of pen, we use the same 1 1/4 inch diameter surface planing bit. With this style, we set up to mill one half of the pen at a time. Once again, you'll want to mill the blank and then check the diameter on the first pen blank. If necessary, make an adjustment to the plunge depth. Once the setup is done, you can mill pens to the final diameter in a single pass. Remember, the harder the wood, the smoother the finished surface will be. Once the machine is set up, you should be able to hold tolerances of a couple thousandths of an inch. To mill indexed flutes, we used a round-over cove bit. We actually used just the tip of the small router bit shown here, but for illustration purposes we also show the larger bit. After setting the plunge depth and the stops, we replaced the handle on the spindle shaft with the indexing gear and used the indexing pin to give us 6 evenly spaced flutes. You can adjust the plunge depth and the number of flutes to change the design to your liking. And that completes the first act of this pen style. To mill the second half of this pen, we simply made an adjustment to the plunge depth and used the surface planing bit to mill the blank round, the same as we did on the first pen. After sanding and polishing, these parts are now ready to assemble. For the next pen, we used a rope molding bit that was designed specifically for this application. We had it custom ground, which cost us about $60. Next, we set up the machine with the .25 gear reduction set and the 32 drive gear to give us a 1.5 inch pitch. To mill the rope design, we centered the router over the pen blank and set the stops to hold it in place. Again, if you have the optional Y-axis drive screw, you can simply set the shaft collars to hold the router over center. Next, we mounted the pen blanks and tightened the nut 1/2 turn. The bit needs to cut right to the end of the blank. Just be sure that you don't go any farther or you'll run the bit into the nut. We set the stops on the linear drive screw to limit the movement of the router carrier on both ends of the pen blank. Again, the bushings on the pen mandrel are the same size as the finished pen blank. Therefore, you can simply plunge the bit down until it rests on the bushing, and then set the plunge stop on the router. Be sure that the tip of the bit just lightly touches the bushing when setting the plunge depth. Now we're ready to mill the first start of the 2-start rope spiral by bringing the bit over center and then milling from end to end. You can mill each start with a single pass. The bit is 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and we want 2 starts. Therefore, we set the pitch to 2 times the diameter of the router bit, or 1.5 inches. Next, we index the part 180 degrees to mill the second start. This second pass completes the rope. Now we need to mill each end of the blank round using the same bit. The plunge depth is already set. You just need to position the bit and then rotate the stock. After we had milled both ends of the pen to a round, we repositioned the stops on the linear drive screw. And then milled the middle section round. After a little sanding, these parts will be ready to finish and assemble. The handle piece for the letter opener is drilled and it has a tube glued in it the same as the pen blanks. You'll need a couple extra bushings to act as spacers when mounting this blank. For this design, we started by milling a 2-start rope, exactly the same as we did with the pen. When the first pass is complete, you'll index for the second pass just as before. The easiest way to index is to use the optional split nut. By opening the nut and moving the router carrier 1/2 the pitch, or 3/4 of an inch, the bit will be positioned for the second pass. And once again we milled the second start in a single pass. Next we set up to mill a spiral in the opposite direction. If necessary, refer to your fast start training video on how to change the spiral direction of your system. Now we simply mill the first pass of a 2-start rope in the opposite direction. And then we complete the diamond pattern by indexing and milling the second start. The final step is to mill the ends round, just as we did on the pen blanks. Once again, the plunge depth is already set. You simply need to position the router and then rotate the stock as you bring the bit over center. And that completes the handle for our letter opener. After the handle has been sanded and finished, you're ready to start assembling the letter opener. Assembling this kit is slightly different than the pens. Here you don't need to use a vise or clamp. The parts simply screw together. For the next project, we decided to use a 1/2 inch diameter core box bit. We set the gears for a 6-inch pitch by using the standard gear reduction set and the 30-tooth drive gear. We measured the diameter of the ends of the magnifying glass to determine the diameter of the handle at the ends. Once again, it was the same size as the bushings that we had purchased for this kit. So we simply plunged the bit down until it lightly touched the bushings from the top. And then set the plunge depth on the router. For the first milling process, we simply raised the router approximately 1/16 of an inch, but left the plunge stop set at the original position. Then we milled the first pass from the tailstock to the headstock and back. To index for the second start, we simply open the split nut and move the router carrier 1 inch, or 1/6 of the pitch. We then repeat this process for each of the 6 starts on this part. You may find that it isn't necessary, but we decided to mill each of these starts with 2 passes. The first pass milling from the tailstock toward the headstock, and the second pass or cleanup pass from the headstock back to the tailstock. To mill the ends of the handle, we plunged down to the final plunge depth and positioned the center of the router bit at the end of the blank, and then rotated the stock as we brought the bit over center. We then repeated this step at the opposite end. This part is now ready to sand, finish, and assemble. Most of the more intricate designs are easier to sand and finish by using the bench grinder and flutter sheets, as shown before. The last step is to press in the parts and assemble the magnifying glass. Next, we'll show you how to make templates for pens, pencils, and other craft items. Start by tracing your design onto a piece of paper, and then cut out the profile. We have provided the pattern for the Mont Blanc style pen, as well as the perfume pen with this video. Cut the paper to the same size as the blank that you will make the template out of. Then, using Scotch tape, attach it to the template blank. The templates in this video are made from a piece of 3/4 inch MDF, 1.5 inches wide by 9 inches long. We used a drum sander to sand the template to the finished shape. We chose to use MDF for the templates because it sands up very smooth. Remember, any bump or ridge on the template will show up on the part. The next step is to mount the template base onto your system. You will also need to attach the stylus to your router base. Next, remove the Y-axis drive screw from your router base so that the router can float in the Y-axis as it follows the template. To set up the template, you can either use a centering tool as shown here, or a router bit that comes to a point. Start by positioning the center of the tool at the end of the pen blank at the headstock end. Then line the template with the slot in the router base as shown here. Note that the template should be approximately 1/8 of an inch from the router carrier. Now slide the router carrier to the opposite end of the template and align it the same way as before. When the template is properly aligned, mark the position of the template on the base. Then drill up through the bottom of the template base to mark the holes on the template at least 2 places. Next, finish drilling the holes in the template. If possible, use a drill press for these holes to keep them straight up and down. If one is not available, go ahead and use a hand drill. Depending upon the type of machine screws that you use to mount the template, you may need to countersink the holes for the head of the screw. Now mount the template to the base. Make sure that it lines up with the marks you made on the base when aligning the template. We use wing nuts on the bottom so that we can easily remove the template at any time. We chose to use a 1/2 inch diameter 2-flute spiral cutter to mill the pen following the template. You can also use a straight cutter, which is less expensive but may not cut as cleanly as the spiral cutter does. Instead of plunging the bit down onto the bushing to set the plunge depth, you need to set the bit just off the side of the bushing, as shown here. Rotate the bit several times to be sure that it just lightly touches the bushing. Once the router is properly positioned, slide the stylus up against the template and lock it in place by tightening the cap screw. To mill the pen blank round, you need to replace the index gear on the spindle shaft with the handle. That way you can rotate the stock by hand as you slowly move the router from end to end. Use one hand to hold the router against the template. The first pass is from the tailstock to the headstock and can be milled fairly quickly. At this point, it doesn't really matter how smooth the surface is. The final pass is from the headstock back to the tailstock. For this pass, move the router very slowly as you rotate the stock. This will make the final cleanup pass. Keep the stylus against the template, but do not put too much pressure on the router. The pen blank is now milled to shape and ready to add the round tenon and other details. At this point, we used a palm sander with 320 grit paper to quickly sand the part. Then we mark the end of the blank for the length of the round tenon. The bit has to go past center to mill the tenon, so we simply rotated the router base so that the stylus would not hit the template. We then set the stops on the linear drive screw to hold the router in place, adjusted the plunge depth, and milled the tenon. For the first pen, make this cut in several passes, making small adjustments to the plunge depth until it is milled to the correct diameter. Then set the plunge depth for the next pen. To mill the flutes in our pen, we chose to use a round-over core box bit with a very small radius. Next, we set the plunge depth by setting the router bit down onto the blank where we wanted to start the flute. Then we set the stops on the linear drive screw and put the indexing gear back on the spindle shaft to mill the flutes. And finally, we set up to mill the bottom half of the pen the same way. Again, you can change the diameter and the number of flutes to suit your taste. And once again, we're ready to sand, finish, and assemble the pen. For the next pen, we set up the gears for a 6-inch pitch using the standard gear reduction set and the 30-tooth drive gear. Everything else is set up exactly the same as the last pen, but on this style we milled 8 spiral flats following the template. For this design, you should mill from the tailstock to the headstock and then back for the cleanup pass. If you divide the pitch, which is 6, by the number of starts, which is 8 in this case, you get 3/4 of an inch, or the distance you need to move the router carrier to mill each start. You simply need to repeat this process for each of the 8 starts. And once again, we flip the router base around to mill the round tenon. This time we disengaged the index gear so that we could rotate the stock by hand and let the nut hold the router carrier in place while milling the tenon. The plunge depth was already set from the last pen, so we can mill the tenon in one quick pass. Once you have set the plunge depth on your router, you can hold tolerances of a couple thousandths of an inch on each part. The milling portion of this pen is now complete and ready to finish and assemble. For our next project, we purchased some transparencies that you can run through the copy machine to copy the pattern. This type of transparency has an adhesive back so that it can stick directly to the MDF. Any template this small does not require that you cut it out with a bandsaw or jigsaw first. You can simply sand it to shape using a drum sander. For this project you will need a different set of bushings because the tube is much larger than the pen blanks. Again, tighten the nut 1/2 a turn to keep it from spinning as you mill the part. You can mount this template using the same technique as we did with the Mont Blanc style pen template. And once again the blank is milled to a round following the template by milling first from the headstock to the tailstock. And then the final pass is made from the headstock back to the tailstock to finish the surface. And now we're ready to add the details. To mill the curve on the bottom of the lid and top of the base, we used a 1/2 inch diameter core box bit. Then we rotated the router base again so that the stylus would not hit the template. Next we set the stops to position the router, adjusted the plunge depth, and milled a cove right between the two pieces. We actually set the stops approximately 1/4 of an inch apart to account for the spacer between the two blanks. To mill the final details, we used a V-groove bit. Then we set the pitch to 4 inches using the standard gear reduction set and the 45-tooth drive gear. We set the stops and the plunge depth on the router and milled the spirals from the headstock to the tailstock and back. You may want to mill in just one direction to eliminate any backlash from the gearing system. We chose to mill 8 starts for this design. If you use more starts, the diamond pattern will be smaller, and obviously if you use less starts, the diamond pattern would be larger. We used the following procedure to mill the 8 spiral starts. Make the first pass from the headstock to the tailstock and then back. Then open the split nut and turn the handle 2 turns, which is 1/2 of an inch, or 1/8 of the 4-inch pitch. Then close the split nut and mill the second pass. Repeat this step for all 8 passes. Next, change the gearing to mill spirals in the opposite direction and repeat the same milling process for another 8 starts. We also added a few coves to dress up the design just a little bit. Now the parts are ready to sand, to finish, and to assemble. Follow the assembly directions that came with the kit. Here are a few more simple designs for you to experiment with. In this video we have shown you the basics for creating all types of custom pens and pencils. Starting with one basic design, you can create many wild variations. There also are kits available for making all kinds of craft items that are beautiful and fun to build. By combining all of the features of Phantom's milling systems, the possibilities are almost endless.